Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
Well, 4 times.
Yeah, but they kept asking him, did you take it? So he says, yeah.
The summer of 1967 and the hippie movement is in full swing. Almost 100,000 young people dressed in hippie attire converge at San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury. Meanwhile, the Beatles' manager Brian Epstein is found dead of a drug overdose. John himself was lost in his ever-growing use of substances, which would leave Paul free to step into the role of leader. This year would see Paul lead the band to make an experimental concept album that legitimised pop music as an art form, and follow it up with a project that would go down as their biggest failure. The year would end with the Beatles planning their escape to Rishikesh, North India, and into the guidance of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This is the story of the Beatles through 1967. January begins with recording sessions at Abbey Road Studios where the band work on Paul's song Penny Lane. At this time, Jane Asher leaves her St John's Wood home she shares with Paul for a tour across America which lasts over 4 months. The day she leaves, Paul does not travel to Heathrow to see her off. A week later, Paul is sat at home watching the BBC One television show Masterworks. On it he sees David Mason, a trumpet player, performing a Bach piece. Impressed, Paul speaks to George Martin the next day about incorporating his trumpet playing into Penny Lane. George Martin, who had a background of recording classical music, was familiar with David Mason and scheduled a recording session. When Mason arrived at Abbey Road, he was bemused by the funny clothes the group were wearing. They were dressed in stripy trousers, floppy hats and bow ties. Mason asked Paul if they'd been filming. John interjected, stating, "Oh no mate, we always dress like this." Mason then recorded the famous trumpet solo heard on Penny Lane. He gave everything he could and played it perfectly on the first take. Everybody knew it was perfect, everyone except Paul. Paul grabbed the talkback mic and stated, "Nice one, David. Can we try another pass?" Mason was stunned. He replied, "Look, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I just can't do it any better." George Martin quickly took to his defence and said, "Good God, you can't possibly ask the man to do that again. It's fantastic." Paul glared at George Martin before grabbing the mic and saying, "Okay, thank you, David. You're free to go now." A month previous, 2 stories were printed in the Daily Mail that inspired John to write a day in the life. One about the Guinness child killed in a car crash, and the other about holes in Blackburn, Lancashire roads. A few days later, the Beatles are photographed at Abbey Road by Jean-Marie Perret for a French magazine. While taking the shots, he finds it difficult to get all 4 of them to stand together. One of the photographs is later used for the cover of the Beatles' next single, Strawberry Fields Forever. As January ends, Strawberry Fields is scheduled for release and filming for the music video begins. Most of February is spent in Abbey Road recording the tracks for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Midway through the month, sequences are shot for the Penny Lane music video. In March, the Beatles win a Grammy Award for the Revolver cover, and Paul is interviewed for the TV show It's So Far Out, It's Straight Down. On the show, Paul talks about the general public's disdain for hippies and attempts to defend the hippie movement. He doesn't do a very good job. Clearly intoxicated, Paul struggles to clearly express his thoughts. At one point he states, "It's a good environment. If there's a whole gang of people who like cider and you're a cider addict, then it's nice to be with them." The Beatles at this point are still under contractual obligation to make a 3rd film for United Artists. In April they presented the latest script written for a film. it's quickly rejected. Recording for Sgt. Pepper continues with George's track Within You Without You. By this point, George is the only Beatle present for these sessions. Meanwhile, Paul flies to San Francisco to visit Jane Asher and check out the scene at Haight-Ashbury. While there, he carries around a cassette with a day in the life recorded on it. On the flight back to England, Paul draws up ideas for the Beatles' next film. The month ends with recording sessions for the soundtrack, The Magical Mystery Tour. May begins with an interview Paul gives to Hit Prada. He tells the reporter the reasons they'd quit touring was because nobody could hear themselves and their stage act hadn't improved in years. He also dismisses claims the group are breaking up. At this point, the Beatles' substance use is the highest it's ever been. They are now using drugs almost daily. When a recording session is booked for the Magical Mystery Tour, the group don't arrive till near midnight. They jam for 7 hours in a stoned haze. This marks the first recording session where nothing is achieved. George Martin watches the chaos and points out that none of their guitars are tuned. They take little notice, brushing him off, stating, "That's okay, we're just doing a demo." George watches on in frustration, chain-smoking the whole time. Sound engineer Jeff Emmerich later wrote, "George couldn't turn around and tell them off because he was scared of being fired. The Beatles were independent clients of his, so he had to tread carefully. Certainly they were the one artist he did not want to lose." Halfway through the month, Paul and Mal Evans go drinking at the Bag of Nails after a recording session, and Paul meets Linda Eastman for the first time. After this, Paul pays a visit to his Scottish farm in Kintyre with Jane Asher. While there, word spreads that there's a Beatle living in Kintyre. Groups gather, but autograph hunters find it very difficult to access Paul's farm for two reasons. One, you have to travel through a neighbour's land to get to it, and Paul's neighbour stops anyone accessing his land. And two, the road leading up to Paul's property is one of the worst on the British Isles. While in his farmhouse, Paul makes a couch from potato boxes and sacks, while Jane bakes bread in the kitchen. Paul decides renovation work will be needed, starting with bigger windows. Luckily, it's sunny the whole time they're there. Nearing the end of the month, the group are pictured in Hyde Park. Sgt. Pepper is officially released, and just 1 day later, A Day in the Life is banned from radio airplay by the BBC. They cite the song advocating drug use as the reason. A spokesman for the BBC states, "We have listened to this song over and over again, and we have decided that it appears to go just a little too far and could encourage a permissive attitude to drug taking." John and Paul deny the song contains any drug references at all. At the same time, the group publicly fight for legalisation of marijuana. On the 16th of June, an article is printed in Life magazine with Paul admitting he's taken LSD. 3 days later, reporters show up at his door and Paul is filmed stating he's taken LSD 4 times. Uproar follows when the footage is broadcast 9 p.m. that night. A week later, a performance of All You Need Is Love is recorded at Abbey Road and broadcast around the world. The song becomes the anthem for 1967. The month ends with George being pulled over for speeding. As a penalty, he's fined £6. In July, the Beatles attend a recording session for the Rolling Stones song We Love You. While there, they add backing vocals. John later describes the song as f***ing bullshit and a rip-off of All You Need Is Love. Towards the end of the month, the group board a plane to Greece to view some islands they plan to purchase. While in Greece, they stay at Magic Alex Mardas's house in Athens. Of the trip, Paul later stated the main reason they wanted to buy an island was so that they could use drugs without being bothered. On the first day they arrive in Greece, a convoy of taxis are booked for transport. On the journey, a fire breaks out in Paul's taxi due to the immense heat. They're forced to turn back and go to a local village. To make matters worse, Magic Alex has been talking about their planned visit and the news is broadcast on Athens radio stations. In the following days, they rent a boat and sail around the islands. John and George are high on acid the whole time, and they sit at the front playing ukuleles, singing Hare Krishna for hours. When they do step off the boat to view an island, it's covered in big pebbles. Magic Alex then states, "It's not a problem, we'll have the military come and lift them off and carry them away." The group quickly change their minds about the whole idea and return home. Magic Alex boards the flight with the group from Greece to London, then with barely any time to pack, he flies with George and Patty to California. In LA, George rents a house on a street named Blue Jay Way. While in California, George travels to San Francisco to visit Haight-Ashbury. After the disastrous visit, George returns to England with a new outlook on the hippie movement. Blue Jay Way ends up being George's farewell to psychedelia. Towards the end of August, the group attend a lecture held by a 56-year-old guru named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi at London's Hilton Hotel. At this lecture, the Maharishi was expected to announce his retirement from administrative activities. The Beatles sat in the front row during the lecture and met the Maharishi afterwards in his hotel suite. There they agreed to attend a 5-day training course in Bangor, Wales. The next day the group board a train and make the 300-mile journey from London to Wales. Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones is also in attendance. On the day they headed to Wales, John's wife Cynthia missed the train. She's separated from the group as they fight through the crowds to board, and police officers hold her back, mistaking her for a fan. During the commotion, John puts his head out the window and calls out to her. It's a poetic foreshadowing as Cynthia stands on the platform with tears running down her face as she helplessly watches John speed away from her. When the Beatles arrived, they stayed in dormitories that belonged to Bangor University, slept in bunk beds, attended lectures, and ate vegetarian food. In accordance with the Maharishi's teachings, the group swear off using drugs. During their stay in Wales, Paul receives a phone call from Peter Brown, Brian Epstein's assistant, to inform him of Brian's death. Paul shares the news with the group, who decide to head back to London. As Paul goes ahead, John and George give interviews to the press.
John, where would you be today without Mr. Epstein?
I don't know.
Of Brian's death, Paul later stated, "It was shattering, sad, and a little frightening. We really loved him." At the beginning of September, the group meet at Paul's house to discuss the imminent Magical Mystery Tour film. George attempts to postpone the project as he wants to go to India to study Hinduism. John and Ringo love the idea, but Paul insists they focus on the Mystery Tour project for now. He states, "Listen, we're going to stay here and do the Mystery Tour, then we can go to India." John at this time asks Paul what they're going to do about a manager. Paul's of the opinion they didn't need one. Now the group weren't touring, Paul believes they could organise themselves and make their own decisions about films and records. On the 11th of September, the Beatles, a film crew and 43 passengers head out to the West Country in a coach and a convoy of cars. They wait to board the coach, which is scheduled to arrive at 10:45. Because it has been decorated with lettering and symbols, the coach is delayed by 2 hours. It's a bad omen of things to come. When the coach finally departs, each passenger is handed £5 to cover food expenses for the week. Filming for the Magical Mystery Tour begins on the journey, but due to bad weather, not much footage can be used. When they arrive at the Royal Hotel at the Den in Devon, Paul holds a press conference outlining the Beatles' intention for the film. On the 12th of September, the group board the coach and set off to Widdicombe. Tempers flare on the way as the coach gets stuck trying to cross a narrow bridge. All the chaos and arguments aboard are filmed. The footage is never used. Persistent bad weather sees them with very little footage for the rest of the day. The day ends with them taking residence at the Atlantic Hotel in Newquay. September the 13th, the group wake up early and head to the Watergate Bay beach. The group are filmed looking through telescopes. The footage is never used. During the afternoon, George doesn't take part in filming and is interviewed for BBC Radio 1 show Seen and Heard. In the interview, George is hesitant to tell the listeners what the film is about, as the group may change the storyline as they go along. George goes on to say the Beatles' future films need to be as progressive as their albums. Citing the evolution from Help to Pepper, the group are hoping for a similar outcome for the Magical Mystery Tour. September the 14th, the group find a secluded cornfield to shoot the Blue Jay Way sequence in. George is filmed sat meditating in a large blue jacket while crowds of onlookers gather. The scene is later scrapped. The group then head back to the Newquay Hotel for a meal which they decide to include in the film. The footage is later scrapped. After that, Paul and Ringo visit a pub in Perranporth and Paul plays piano while there. This is the actual piano Paul played, still there to this day. Later that night, a fan breaks into the Mystery Tour bus and robs George's blue denim jacket. September the 15th, the group head back to London and stop off at a chip shop along the way. This wraps up all the filming around the West Country. The rest of the footage is planned to be shot in London. Filming resumes in 2 days. September the 18th, filming at a club in Soho is delayed as many of their instruments were stolen the night before. On this day, the scene where John and George watch the live band is shot. September the 19th, the Beatles are forced to film the remaining scenes at the West Malling Air Station due to Twickenham Studios being booked up. The group decide to stay at a nearby hotel to avoid a long commute. September the 20th, the morning begins with filming for I Am the Walrus. In the afternoon, the scene in which they're dressed as wizards is shot. September the 21st, filming for Blue Jay Way is shot. As with the previous scrap footage in the cornfield, Harrison is filmed sat in a meditation-like position. September the 22nd, George does not turn up for filming as he's bedridden suffering from influenza. A scene which appears at the start of the movie in which Ringo buys tickets for the Magical Mystery Tour from a shopkeeper played by Lennon is shot. September the 23rd, the Magical Mystery Tour marathon is filmed in which a tug of war between children and blindfolded vicars takes place and a race ensues in which the Mystery Tour bus and George's Mini is included. September the 24th, the final day of filming at the air station. A staircase and ballroom is constructed. Your Mother Should Know is shot while the Beatles perform an old-fashioned dance sequence. With the scene finished, filming for the Magical Mystery Tour is complete. September the 25th, editing begins on the Magical Mystery Tour at Norman's Film Productions in Soho. The process is expected to take 7 days. It takes 11 weeks in total. Paul is present for the entire time. The other 3 Beatles make the odd appearance. 10 hours of footage is cut down to 53 minutes. It's later said that editing lasted so long due to arguments between the group to which scenes should be used. As October begins, the Beatles decide extra footage for the film is needed. They return to West Malling Air Station. On the 30th of October, Paul flies to France to film sequences for The Fall on the Hill. When Paul arrives at the airport, he realises he's left his passport at home. Paul is able to convince immigration to let him through based on the recognition of his identity. November the 3rd, the band gather at Ringo's house and they're filmed playing around in his garden. The footage is added to the Blue Jay Way sequence. November the 6th, a photo shoot is taken to promote their next animated film, Yellow Submarine. After this, work continues on the accompanying album for the film, The Magical Mystery Tour. November 10th, a music video is shot for the group's next single, Hello Goodbye. 2 sequences are filmed that day. The first of the group performing on stage dressed in their Sgt. Pepper attire, the second of them dressed in their Please Please Me attire. The entire video is directed by Paul. November the 27th, the Magical Mystery Tour album is released. It receives glowing reviews and all eyes eagerly anticipate the film. December the 1st, Hello Goodbye goes to number 1, and 6 days later the group open a shop called the Apple Boutique. Around this time, Ringo flies to Rome to star in the film Candy. The film also stars Richard Burton and Marlon Brando. Brando later states, "Probably the worst film I ever did was Candy." December the 25th, Paul and Jane Asher announced their engagement. 1 day later, the Magical Mystery Tour film is aired on BBC in black and white. The film faces harsh criticism from critics and viewers. The year ends with Paul appearing on the David Frost Show to defend the Magical Mystery Tour. The interview starts with Frost asking Paul why he thinks critics didn't like the film. Paul answers, "I think people were looking for a plot, and there wasn't one." When asked if his own opinion of the film has changed after the backlash, Paul answers, "I think it's as good as I always thought it was." Paul then goes on to compare filmmaking to making an album. He states, "We make a record, and all the songs don't necessarily have to fit in with each other, you know? They're just a selection of songs. But you go to make a film, I don't know, you seem to have a thread to pull it all together." Paul then says they thought calling it a Magical Mystery Tour, the audience wouldn't expect a straightforward plot, and they could throw all different sequences together much like with an album. Paul later says he believes the film will get better with every view. The interview ends with Frost observing Paul doesn't take advice from anyone. Paul responds with his philosophy on life, which is to be yourself. He tells Frost they could have made an easily digestible film for audiences, but it wouldn't have been genuine. He ends his point stating, "We thought, well, we'll try it our way, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter." 1968 would be a tough year for the Beatles, with arguments, drug arrests, and a new addition to John's life that will threaten the future of the band.